What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. At the end of every season, I always like to look back at preseason predictions and see how accurate we were, and look at other predictions as well. Just see which teams overperformed, which teams underperformed. Before we get to that, though, I'm actually going to do some team awards, and I'm going to do this for all the Power 5 conferences. Where we'll go through and I'll show you which ones I'm talking about here, and just kind of recap the season. So we're starting here with the SEC, and we will start with the biggest surprises. The biggest surprises in the SEC: Missouri and Ole Miss. Missouri, I think a lot of people expected them to be pretty good this year, and some people even expected them to be a surprise team. But 10-2, I mean, that was really a good season for Missouri, and even against, like, in the losses, look at LSU. That was a really close game, and against Georgia, they were competitive. So this is a Missouri team that was not that far away. From maybe playing in Atlanta in the SEC championship. So they were definitely a surprise. And then Ole Miss, I don't know that they were really better than I expected them to be, but they were able to win some close games, and that's something that they had struggled with a little bit in the past. Able to win some close games, able to get to 10-2. That record at the end of the day, definitely a surprise for me. And I think everyone expected this team to, maybe at least lose 3 or 4 games. But going 10-2, again, really good season for Ole Miss. These teams were the big surprises. How about the biggest disappointments? We're talking about Arkansas and South Carolina. Arkansas, just an awful season for them. And this is an Arkansas team that actually, both of these teams in the preseason, in the early offseason last year, I was really low on both of these teams. I didn't expect them to do very good. Over time, you hear all these things, and Arkansas's got this. Arkansas, South Carolina, look at what they returned here. But there were still some concerns that I had. With Arkansas, it was the wide receivers. They had to replace a lot on defense. South Carolina had to replace a lot on defense, on the offensive line. And I wish that I just gone with my gut, because my gut would have probably put me predicting both of these teams not making it to a bowl game. But I didn't listen to my gut. As the offseason went along, I started to feel a little bit better about these teams. And I think most people expected these two teams to at least get to a bowl game. Big time disappointments, though, for both Arkansas and South Carolina. And for South Carolina, it's really more about where they were last year, coming off of 8 wins. And then to drop all the way to 5-7, just a big disappointment there. And then Arkansas, again, you expected this team to at least get to a bowl game. Both these teams definitely big disappointments in the SEC this year. How about the top offenses? We got LSU and Georgia. These two offenses, LSU's no doubt about it. This is arguably the best offense in the country. I believe statistically they were the best offense in the country. And then it was between Georgia and Ole Miss for that other spot for me. Kind of looking at these two teams, I did look at the stats. Georgia a little bit ahead of Ole Miss in terms of yards per game. And it was just the balanced attack for Georgia, and Ole Miss was balanced as well. I mean, you really can't go wrong with Georgia or Ole Miss putting them in this spot for top offense. But LSU, obviously, the clear number one. And then top defenses, Texas A&M and Georgia. I felt like this was pretty obvious. Texas A&M was sneaky good on defense. This was a top 10 defense, and Georgia maybe at times didn't look as good, but when they turned it on, this was the best defense in the SEC. It was a weird year for Georgia, the way they played, the way they were not super consistent. Had times, again, where they didn't look great, but when they turned it on, man, this defense was really good. And statistically, again, these were the 2 top defenses in the SEC. So good years for them. How about the most improved team? Well, that's going to be Missouri. Again, coming off of a not great year last year, and then this year they get all the way to 10-2. That one feels pretty obvious. Can they keep it going into the future? We shall see. SEC is going to get tougher, of course, with Oklahoma and Texas coming into the conference. Biggest drop, South Carolina, already talked about them, and then Vanderbilt. So Vanderbilt goes from 5-7 down to 2-10. This is a team that I did not expect to win a conference game, so I wasn't surprised by this. But again, they had built some momentum in 2022, won a couple of SEC games, and then all that's gone. Vanderbilt's back to the basement. And just looking at this conference and looking at how a lot of programs are trending in the right direction, they're getting better. You wonder, when will Vanderbilt win another SEC game? They've had a bunch of players enter the transfer portal. It just feels like Vandy is going to be down there stuck at the bottom for a long time. Next up, we've got the most underrated team. So talked about the No, we have not talked about the most overrated team. We'll talk about them in a second. Most underrated team, Texas A&M. So Texas A&M, look, they went 7-5. I think their over/under was at 7.5, I believe. This was a team that was expected to be pretty good, but not a team that was expected to really. I know there were some out there that thought that they maybe could make a run in the SEC West, but most people did expect them to lose at least 3 or 4 games. I know 7-5. You look at that record, not a good season, but look at how good their defense was. You look at that Miami game, they kind of let it get away in the second half, but it was a competitive game. They played Alabama tough, only lost by 6, only lost by 7 to Tennessee, only lost by 3 to Ole Miss, and then against LSU, they were basically playing third string guys, and they only lost by 12. This was a good team. This was a pretty good 7-5 team. They beat Mississippi State 51-10. They beat South Carolina by multiple scores. They beat Auburn 27-10. I mean, this was a pretty good team at 7-5. It really surprised me that they fired Jimbo Fisher. When you look at Connor Wigman going down with the injury, if they had had him healthy, this team probably would have won at least a couple more games, and they would have had a pretty good season, as good as their defense was. And again, injuries cost them there at quarterback. But yeah, I thought this team was really underrated. I thought Texas A&M had a chance to build off of this season and maybe have a really good year next year, but now they have kind of decided to rebuild. There are going to be a lot of players in the transfer portal. I don't know how they're going to look next year with a new coach, but I felt like they were underrated this year. But overrated has to go to Ole Miss. Ole Miss was 10-2. But did Ole Miss feel like they were a team that was kind of on the same level as Georgia or Alabama or even Missouri? Did they feel like that? I'm going to say no, they really didn't. They lost to Georgia 52-17. They lost to Alabama by 14, and that was a time when Alabama was still trying to figure things out. They had struggled against South Florida and all that. So you look at how they played against top competition, not great. And then they had a lot of close wins. LSU was a close game, one-score game. Arkansas was a one-score game. Auburn was a one-score game. Texas A&M, a 3-point game. So you go down the list there and say, Ole Miss, they were a good team this year. They were a top 25 team. Don't get me wrong. But were they on that elite level? I'm going to say no. They were, yes, 10-2, very impressive. But compare them to some of the other 10-2 teams. And, we'll find out when they play Penn State in the bowl game. Penn State, maybe they were overrated as well. They really didn't play anyone besides Michigan and Ohio State. They lost both of those games. They were more competitive, though, in their games than Ole Miss was against Georgia and Alabama. So, yeah, I'm going to say Ole Miss. Definitely overrated this year in terms of not as good as their record would suggest. But still, a good team. Don't get me wrong. Ole Miss, again, great season, good team, but a little bit overrated. Game of the year has to go to the Iron Bowl, Auburn, Alabama. If this game had not been the way it was, I think your next pick would be LSU Ole Miss. That was a great game, a high-scoring game coming down to the wire. But Alabama Auburn, just because of the implications. If Auburn had won that game, if Alabama had not made that play at the end, Alabama would not be in the college football playoff. So just a huge, huge game. A lot of swings in this one, and it was definitely the game of the year in the SEC, in my opinion. All right, how about the brightest future? We're going Alabama and Auburn. Same teams we just talked about. So for Alabama, they are actually pretty young. This was a young team this year, and they are super talented. They're going to bring in another great recruiting class, and it feels like Alabama may be starting to maybe they jump back ahead of Georgia in terms of top program in the SEC. We'll see maybe looking at next year how that plays out. And then Auburn went 6-6, not a great year, but look at how they competed against Alabama and against Georgia, against some of the top teams, and the way they have started to recruit. Hugh Freeze, I think, doing some really good things at Auburn, and I think the future very bright for them. I think we're going to see some Iron Bowls in the future, especially with a 12-team playoff where there are playoff implications maybe for both teams. So this is going to be a great rivalry, I feel like, moving forward. It's already arguably the greatest rivalry in the country. If it's not one, it's number 2, but it could mean even more as we head into the future. And again, with that 12-team playoff, maybe giving Auburn a better shot to compete for playoff spots. All right, how about the bleakest future? I think it's Arkansas and Florida. Arkansas has seen a ton of players enter the transfer portal. Sam Pittman does come back, but I think they probably should just went ahead and fired him and just started a complete rebuild, because it just doesn't feel like this team is going to it doesn't feel like they're heading in the right direction. And then for Florida, you lose arguably your top player on offense and defense to the transfer portal. Same thing. I think Billy Napier probably just they're going to have a rough season next year, mostly because of their schedule. It is absolutely brutal. And so I just don't see anything great in the near future for either one of these programs. All right, let's get to the teams now that met expectations. Auburn, Georgia, Florida, and Kentucky. All 4 of these teams, they were right around expectations. Georgia, you could say, well, they were expected to win the SEC. But look, they went 12-0. Florida and Kentucky were about where they were expected to be. Teams that exceeded expectations, Missouri and Ole Miss for sure. And I've got Alabama on here as well. I mean, I know most people expected them to be right there in the SEC championship, have a chance to win it. But beating Georgia the way they did, and a lot of expectations. A lot of people thought this team might lose a couple of games. So I'm going to say they exceeded expectations. You could also say maybe they met expectations. But that means a lot of teams were below expectations. Arkansas, Texas A&M, LSU, Tennessee, Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, and South Carolina. And so what I did here, to make it into this list, you had to be under the over-under win total from Vegas. You had to be below my predictions, and you had to be below Athlon's predictions, which we're going to look at in just a second. And so that's the criteria. Texas A&M was not, and LSU, they were just like a half game below the over-under. So they were close to expectations, but both Athlon and myself, we had them higher than what they did. And so that's why I'm going to say these teams were below expectations. A lot of disappointments in the SEC, and really Ole Miss and Missouri, the only teams that exceeded those expectations, and maybe Alabama. So let's get to the predictions, and you see the record for every team. This was our projected record back in like before spring. I do a very early projected record, which is based a lot off of what the teams did the year before, and then just kind of roughly looking at how good each team is going to be and putting that up against the schedule. Missouri did a lot better, 6-6. Tennessee was about where they were projected. Kentucky about where they were at the same spot. Florida about where they were projected. South Carolina a couple of games below, and then Vanderbilt. And again, this is because of 2022, because they had the good year in 2022. That's why that projection was as high as it was. You see my personal predictions. Nailed it with Georgia. Missouri, way off. Tennessee, off by a couple of games. I thought they were going to be better. Kentucky was about where I expected. Florida was exactly where I expected. South Carolina, about where I expected. And then Vanderbilt, about where I expected. So really only missed Missouri and Tennessee. Those are the only ones we missed by 2 or more games. So pretty good predictions here in the East. You look at Athlon. They were very similar to me. They were closer on Tennessee. They were the same with Kentucky, same with Florida. They were higher on South Carolina, so I did do a little better there. And then Vanderbilt, I actually had them at 4-8, so I did a little bit better there. The over-unders for these teams: Georgia 11.5, Missouri 6.5, Tennessee 9.5. Under. You look at Kentucky, they went over. You look at Florida, they were under. South Carolina under. Vanderbilt under. So a mix of over and unders here, and it's interesting that 1 and 2, obviously, they went over, and then Kentucky went over. The other teams went under. So let's look now at the SEC West, and these are the records. This is our projection, again, from before the spring. Alabama at 10-2, Ole Miss 7-5, LSU 10-2, A&M 7-5, Auburn 7-5, Mississippi State 6-6, and Arkansas 7-5. My predictions: missed Alabama by a game, missed Ole Miss by 2 games, missed LSU by 2, and I talked about my gut feeling. My gut feeling was to pick Florida State over LSU, but I changed that prediction. Wish I had stuck with that one, and then I would have been better on Florida State as well. But I talked myself into LSU just because of that offense, and the offense didn't disappoint. It was the defense that really disappointed. A&M I thought would be better, and again, if Connor Wigman had not gotten injured, I think very possible that they could have gotten to 9-3. Auburn was right where I expected them to be. Mississippi State 1 game under. And then there's Arkansas. Big disappointments. They were 3 games under where I predicted. Athlon, they nailed it with Alabama. Same as me with Ole Miss. They were a little bit lower on LSU, but both Athlon and me, we both thought LSU would do better than 9-3. They were closer on A&M at 8-4. Same as me on Auburn at 6-6. Same as me on Mississippi State at 6-6. And then they were the same as me as Arkansas. So my predictions and Athlon's predictions very, very similar here. In the SEC West. And so you look at the over-unders. Alabama was over. Ole Miss was over. LSU was under. A&M was under. Auburn was under. Mississippi State was under. and Arkansas was under. So a lot of unders, and again, a lot of disappointments. And that also, I think, goes to the non-conference. Speaks about the non-conference. These teams the SEC did not do good in the non-conference, and because of that, that's a big reason why a lot of teams in the SEC wound up under that over-under win total. So just a recap of the SEC, my predictions and Athlon's predictions and what Vegas had to say, and then we're going to do this for all the Power 5 conferences. So your thoughts on the SEC, what surprised you, what did you get exactly right? Go ahead and let me know which predictions did you have that came true. And maybe next year, so those awards that I did at the beginning of the video, maybe going into next year, I will try to predict those. So I'll try to pick the biggest disappointments, the team that's going to be overrated, the team that's going to be underrated, all of that. We'll do that next year, and that'll be kind of fun to look at the end of the season. But again, your thoughts on the SEC, let me know down in the comments below.